Hello and welcome to Wessex Museums' first ever podcast series, Interrogating Hardy. This series we will be focusing on Thomas Hardy and if he is the unique hero we, or at least I, would like to think of him as. My name is Harriet Still and I am the Wessex Museums Hardy curator, as well as being the host of this podcast. This aptly named podcast series will question how far his writing did speak about multiple issues, if writing alone was enough to call him an activist, and how this can reflect our own time. Welcome to another episode of Interrogating Hardy. In this episode, we will look at the writer Thomas Hardy's relationship with relationships. Through his novels, he created many romantic moments and seductive plot lines. But in his later novels and his grief poetry, he explores the gritty reality of love and marriage, using lines such as, "People go on marrying because they can't resist natural forces, although many of them may know perfectly well that they are possibly buying a month's pleasure with a life's discomfort." A bit unromantic and pessimistic in my view, but that's what we're going to explore today. And so we're going to look at how this view of relationships is reflected in his own life and the world that he inhabited. Was he unique in his cynicism about relationship, or in his portrayal of the ideal relationship? And so to help me on my quest, I'm joined today by Holly, who graduated from the Institute of Public Understanding of the Past at the University of York, and who is also the host of the podcast Past Loves, which explores the greatest love stories from history, and by the writer Christopher Nicholson, who wrote Winter, a semi-fictional reimagining of Hardy's relationship with his second wife Florence and the actress Gertrude Bugler. So, welcome to this show. Really looking forward to this discussion and very good to have you here today.
No, thank you for having us.
Hello, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So I think first, just to set the scene, I wanted to ask Holly about what I believe to be one of the most iconic relationships of the Victorian period, which of course would be Victoria and Albert. Would you be able to just tell us a bit about that? Was that held up on a pedestal as we now see it to be, or was that seen as quite an unusual relationship? And how did that influence general Victorian ideas of love and how love was perceived?
I mean, that's quite a big question. But to be fair to them, Victoria and Albert's relationship was extremely big. Obviously, as the reigning monarch, having this kind of great love story was something that, of course, everyone was going to be interested in. They fell in love and did have a very intense relationship, especially from Victoria's side. I mean, when you read some of her journals, the intensity of her feeling towards Albert is quite overwhelming, I think, in many senses. But she obviously portrays that relationship in interesting ways as well. So if we think about their wedding day, which is something that has become incredibly iconic because of her choice to wear a white dress, and therefore we now all wear white dresses, but she also chose to prioritize her wifeliness rather than her kind of monarchness on that day. And so she included that she would obey in her vows. She opted to forego things like a crown or fur or kind of any royal accessories on that day. So that was a really big outward signal that she was choosing this love match with Albert. And then obviously Victoria's incredible propensity to grieve for the rest of her life in such an obvious, vivid way is a really clear indication of like the way she wanted to mythologize Albert and their love, and this incredible love story that they had. I mean, I always said she because that is her interpretation once he was no longer there, but that they had. And so I think that they're a really interesting couple to be at the head of this time when romance was becoming more important in marriage, and marriage was also at the same time becoming something that was more secular, and so different laws were being brought in to change how marriage was constructed. And so yes, I think they are quite rightly kind of the place to start, because you can reference them for all aspects of.
They set the tone.
They do set the tone, and it's a pretty high bar, I think.
Well, and I'm curious about this, about how much was marriage seen as almost kind of the ultimate goal? Because within Hardy's own life, his mother had gone into service at 13, as we've talked about in previous episodes. And when she got pregnant, it seems like it was actually quite unexpected. It wasn't part of her life plan. She'd wanted to go off to London. She'd wanted to carry on her career. And suddenly she's married with kids in Dorset. And even at the end of her life, she says, like, I've been looking after someone else's house with someone else's things in it. It didn't feel like hers. Was that kind of like pushing back against the norm set by Victoria and Albert, or actually were there lots of people who remained unmarried and chose to follow a career instead?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated because at the end of the day, we're talking about generalizations, and there are always people who are going to live outside of expectations, societal expectations, and also outside of what was legally deemed acceptable as a marriage. And I think thinking about their love and the idea of romance at this time, whilst we talk about kind of romance becoming this dominant rationale for marriage over the 19th century, we also can acknowledge that there were other opportunities. Industrialization, I think this was something that you mentioned in your women's episode. Industrialization was creating opportunities so that people could go and work. But marriage was still the way in which people secured their stability at home. So whether you were working class and you were needing to ensure the immediate survival of your family was going to continue, or whether you were upper class and you were still trying to protect and preserve your property, marriage was still a really important transactional way of making sure that all of those things still happened. And so yes, there were people who remained unmarried, and obviously industrialization and increasing women's rights over Hardy's life did allow this, but equally there were substantial benefits that meant that marriage continued to be what was expected of you.
Absolutely, and I think that's where it's interesting when you're reading Hardy, because there's a quote where Bathsheba in Far From Madding Crowd says basically, I'd be really happy to get married as long as I could do it without having a husband. And this kind of sense of like, yeah, I want to have the party, and I want to have the dress, and I want to have all the beautiful things that Victoria had in her marriage, but I don't want to have the husband, because that suddenly comes with, like you said, that kind of secular legal kind of shackles, which, as I understand in this period, it's before you've got the different acts that come in later in the 1870s and 80s. And so women are still quite bound by and have quite a lot of freedom stripped by marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to remember that the Married Women's Property Act came in 1870, which was when any money that women earned could be treated as her own property. And then it was in 1882 that actually married women could have possession of their estate as her separate estate. Bathsheba was going against people's expectations that she was going to get married, and she was just going to run this farm on her own, and she could do it.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that he's creating these characters that are effectively fulfilling like that kind of romantic narrative that now we see, you know, Far From Madding Crowd as this kind of beautiful love story, and yet it's not falling into that kind of Victorian Albert narrative plot that had been set up certainly by them in the early 40s, late 1830s. But I'm now going to return slightly to Thomas Hardy's love life, because I love this sense of Thomas Hardy, the teenager, and he seems to always be quite awkward, is my impression. I'm curious, slightly, Christopher, having got to know him so well in writing your novel, did you go delving that far back into Hardy the teenager? Because I always get the impression of him kind of sitting on the side, kind of fancying these girls and never daring to talk to them.
Yeah, in Howard Jacobson's novel Peeping Tom, which was in the early 1980s about Hardy, I think Jacobson says something to the effect that Hardy could never in his life see a pretty woman cross a street without a pang tugging on his heartstrings. I mean, I think Hardy was fascinated by women from a very early age. Although my novel talks about Hardy in extreme old age, the complications of his personality existed right from the start. He was very shy, very reticent. He was fascinated by women, and I think a lot of that must have come from watching what happened in his own family. His mother, he was very close to his younger sister Mary, who never marries. And, well, looking back at the novels, of course, Far From Madding Crowd, he wrote it when he was 34. And in many ways, it follows the characteristic romantic trope in which marriage is the end of the story. By the time he's in his 50s, by the time he comes to write Tessa D'Urville's Jude the Obscure, marriage is not the end of the story. Marriage, in a sense, is the end of one story, but another one then begins. So it's a different perspective.
No, exactly. And I suppose he's writing Far from the Madding Crowd the year that he gets married to Emma Gifford, and that's, like you say, that kind of allies with that sense of kind of hopefulness and the potential of relationship, and the idea that marriage is kind of just the door opening into the great expanse beyond. The marriage is not just the end, and that's one thing that I think is quite often missing from Hardy's novels. If there are children, they are babies, or they're very young children that die quite early on. He doesn't really have that sense of the next generation being raised. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that at all.
Well, of course, one of the really interesting questions for biographers of Hardy is quite why the relationship to Emma broke down. And one of the theories that has been put forward is it's because there was an inability to have children, and that in some sense meant the relationship was unfulfilled. There are lots of other possible reasons. The lack of children, I think, is very interesting in the novels. I mean, I don't know whether he felt competent in writing about children when he didn't have children himself. That's possible.
No, absolutely. And yes, because I understand they were quite close to Emma's niece and nephew, but it's not quite the same having someone come to stay for the summer holidays a couple of times as actually kind of going through the kind of day-to-day grind of having your own children. And Holly, do you get any sense of how literature at this point is portraying children in relationships, and is that kind of normal to just end at marriage and then just kind of say right, and then other things happen?
What I would mention is Jane Eyre, and that is kind of a messy relationship in many ways because of the wife that Rochester still has when he is trying to marry Jane. But at the end, that finishes with the baby, but no, there's no further than that. And that, just when you were talking, rung a bell with me of, oh, actually, we have a similar example there, where going through all of these trials and tribulations to get to the point of this secure, happy marriage, and then the baby comes, and then that's the end of the book.
No, absolutely. And picking up on what you say about messy relationships, I mean, that's one of the things that I find so interesting about Hardy, is that it is so often someone being torn between all these different options, and this sense that relationships aren't clean cut and aren't simple and aren't straightforward. You don't just fall for the person who would be right for you. You quite often fall for the person who might be wrong for you. There's this short story that he writes about two couples who meet at a party and basically think that they're with the wrong person, so they agree to switch and both go off and marry each other, and then you work out through the kind of rest of the short story that actually this was the absolute wrong mistake, and it leads to horrible consequences. But that sense of sometimes we can't end up with a perfect person, sometimes we always have to make do. And I think with his novels, quite often it's not the really exciting, lust-filled, wonderful, sparkly person like the kind of Sergeant Troy or Clem Yearbright who comes along who just seems like the perfect person. It's quite often the person that ends up being the happy ending is the person who's almost like kind of the calmer, more stalwart person who's been in the background all along. And I just found that quite interesting in terms of how he brings about this messy relationships and says actually the messiness is all part of the reality. It isn't just a kind of straightforward line of narrative from meeting the perfect person to ending up with the perfect person. I'm also quite curious to know, Christopher, because I think that kind of touches on what your novel wrangles with, is that in his later life there was this huge messiness in his personal life with Florence and Emma and Gertrude. And I was just wondering if you could kind of outline a bit what the plot is there and how you've kind of brought that into that novel.
He's just incredibly intuitive about women. One of the complaints that was made by Emma, and I think to some extent by Florence, was that he was brilliant at portraying women in the novels, but when it came to women in real life, he was absolutely terrible. And the novel that I wrote about, set in the winter of 1924-25, you've got Hardy by this stage deep in old age. He's in his mid-80s, and he's married to Florence, his second wife. She's aged 45, and she's a very nervous woman. She's worried about her own health, and she's particularly worried about how much and to what extent Hardy really loves her. So you've got Hardy in his mid-80s, and Florence living at Maxgate, a very dark, big house, surrounded by trees. And Hardy is still living the kind of reclusive life of the artist that he's led for so many years. Every day he retires to his study, he sits at his desk, he writes poems. Meanwhile, in Dorchester, an amateur theatrical troupe called the Hardy Players are about to produce what is the first ever English version of his favourite novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And playing the part of Tess is a rather beautiful local woman called Gertrude Bugler, long raven hair. She's aged 25 and she's married. Nonetheless, Hardy appears to become infatuated with her, or at least that is the impression that Florence gets, that her husband in his mid-80s has somehow become infatuated with a woman in her 20s. And this would be laughable, but for the fact that Hardy has such form on this matter, and Florence knows all about it. In the past, there have been endless infatuations that Hardy's had with younger women. I think behind all this, Hardy had a sense, which he got from Shelley, of love as being something that moved from person to person. It didn't stay in one person. Ideal love was a thing that existed, but it could shift from one person to the other. And Shelley wrote a poem, Epipsychidion, in 1821, which describes this thing happening very exactly how this happens. Hardy was an absolute devotee of Shelley. So I think a lot of that conception about free love and his antipathy towards the institution of marriage goes right back to Shelley. In this novel that I wrote, Florence becomes more and more agitated and eventually breaks into Hardy's study and discovers a poem that he's written to Gertrude, this young actress, in which he proposes eloping with her. Again, completely laughable. But this was something that I was told by an old lady whom I met, who knew Gertrude, that he had in fact written a poem about eloping with her. I don't think in the least he was thinking of eloping with her. I think he was in love with the idea of eloping with her because he had such an incredibly mobile imagination. And that allowed him to imagine that he's a young man falling in love again.
And I think it's really interesting because you do see that happening in his characters as well, this sense of flying from one character to another. When you have Eustacia who falls for Clym and then re-falls for Wildeve, or when you have Sue Bridehead who seems to be in love with Jude, then marries Phillips and then seems to almost fall out of love with Jude. And that sense of characters having that flightiness that he kind of brings into his novels, as well as, yeah, as you said, it seemed to actually kind of colour his own life as well. And I was curious as well when I was reading your novel about that interplay between Emma and Florence, and that sense of almost kind of Emma being a bit like a Rebecca figure from Daphne du Maurier. She's kind of haunting the story even when she's not actually present. And I was wondering if that could tie in, I was wondering if we could explore at this point, Holly, grief and love and how that all comes into the Victorian period.
Well, I think when I mentioned earlier, the Victorian period, grief was it was something that was expressed so outwardly in a lot of ways. They have a lot of objects to depict their grief in many ways, like death masks, which was something that was very much looked upon as an important aspect of that grief process. And so I think it's really interesting that reference you make about Rebecca and Daphne du Maurier in this case, because I think that it probably does come through very clearly. I don't know what you think, Chris.
It is quite extraordinary how Hardy wrote what undoubtedly are his greatest poems in a fit of grief immediately after Emma had died. And he'd been completely estranged from Emma in the house, even though they were still living together for a sort of sake of respectability. And then in the months that follow, he goes back to the memories of the woman he first met. He goes back to Cornwall, to North Cornwall, to the place where he first met her, and he writes these extraordinarily tender, lyrical expressions of love lost and of regret and all the rest of it. Now, Florence was already on the scene, and Florence kind of knew all this. But I'm not sure that Florence and Hardy quite had the same sense when they went into marriage of what that marriage was going to be like. In one of the letters, Harriet, that you sent me, that the museum has, Florence is writing immediately after they've got married. And she says, it's on the 24th of February 1914, although he's much older than myself, it is a genuine love match. And then rather significantly, she goes, on my part at least, for I suppose I ought not to speak to him. But 14 days before this, Hardy himself had written to one of his friends about the marriage. And he said the step of marriage was taken in the hope that the union of two rather melancholy temperaments may result in cheerfulness.
Oh, Hardy!
Those are two radically different accounts of what it is to be married. So I mean, I think they had great affection for each other, but I think living with Hardy, who was this dedicated artist, must have been very different. And the presence of the first wife, must have accentuated it as well. There was a joke. As Hardy got older, he used to take visitors down to Stinsford, to the graveyard where Emma was buried. And he used to say that Florence would be buried next door to her, and he'd be buried in the middle. And he used to make jokes about whether he'd be buried a bit closer to Emma or a bit closer to Florence.
Oh no!
Oh my gosh.
I mean, it does seem very Victorian, joking about where you will be in death.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the idea of like grief and love in death as a way of, yes, very much in perpetuity, just together.
I do wonder what what Emma would have thought if she'd known that she was going to be sharing a grave with Florence. And do you think that's the problem through his whole life, is he has almost this kind of ideal of what a woman should be, and then no matter whether the women that he actually has in his life just never really kind of, I don't know, they're just too real for him almost.
Well, I would say it's quite difficult to ever be perfection. Like, at the end of the day, you're going to be a real person and you might annoy each other every once in a while.
And my impression is that his mother was such a strong figure within his life, and I think the way that she had these strong views against marriage and on bettering yourself and on climbing the social ladder, I think it was almost as if no woman could really ever compare to her. And I think, Chris, you say something in your novel about, at one point, Florence or Emma asks whether he loves the mother more than he loves the wife, and he's kind of saying, I love them both equally, and that's kind of taken to be the wrong answer. Yeah, do you feel that might resonate at all?
I think that's the case. I mean, I think the mother was a very strong influence. I think the whole of Hardy's family was a problem. Emma found them a real problem. Kate, one of his sisters, and Mary, she felt that they were just too intrusive. Florence had to get rid of Kate. As soon as Emma had died, Kate moved in and tried to become the housekeeper. Florence had to get rid of her. That family, that presence was very, very strong. I'm sure it was part of Hardy's makeup. The only thing I would say about all this is that, in a sense, by concentrating on Hardy's biography and the man, you need to remember that he's an artist and all his life is devoted towards his art. And one of the things that Hardy managed was to transmute all the pain and difficulties of his marriage into his art. So in a sense, he needed to have that kind of conflict and pain. I don't think he wanted a happy relationship in that sense. I think that might just have killed off his art.
I kind of suffer for your art. Well, it's interesting because he says, one of the quotes from the Dinas, I mean, initially this is about war rather than love, but it says about peace makes but poor reading and war makes rattling good history. And that sense of almost kind of like conflict is necessary for art and for drama and for entertainment. Yeah, I mean, where do you end up sitting on Christopher? Do you find actually his biographical life more fascinating than the fictional lives that he portrays, or do you actually find that diving into his fiction is actually more satisfying after kind of wrangling around in his biography?
I'm not sure I split the two, frankly. I mean, I think his life is fascinating. He's a really complicated and interesting man. The complications are there not least because he was so secretive, so there's lots of stuff to be discovered about him. But in a way, occasionally people criticised the novel I wrote on the grounds that one shouldn't have delved. You shouldn't be writing novels about real people in that kind of way. But Hardy's novels are all about real people. His fiction and his life are just intricately tangled up one in the other. So I'm not sure. I mean, if I had to choose, if someone said to me, Aki, you've either got the biography or you've got the fiction, I'd go for the fiction. And I'd also actually go for the poems, which we haven't talked about at all. But increasingly, I suspect, as time goes by, you may find that Hardy's great reputation may rest not on the novels at all, although they are wonderful representations of the changing social and economic realities of rural England in the 19th century. But they may rest on the poems, which are extraordinarily delicate and sensitive and technically brilliant and actually just marvellous works in themselves.
That's really interesting. And going back to the bit you said, I mean, earlier, that is interesting to think Hardy might actually approve of what you've done in terms of he was constantly taking real stories and weaving them into fiction because he felt...
He wouldn't have approved at all. Absolutely not. He would have he would have loathed the idea of anybody writing a novel about him.
What I find interesting, though, is exactly what he did to everyone else. When you constantly, when you read his book of facts and he's taken the wife's sale at Stamford and going and rewriting it and imagining the relationships and the loves and the losses behind that. And so I think, even if he didn't like it, I think it's some kind of poetic justice that after writing about so many real people and trying to imagine the emotions that racked their bodies and their minds, that actually you've gone and taken his life and tried to imagine the emotions that racked him.
Well, maybe, but nonetheless, he essentially wrote a fake biography. I mean, there's a biography which was constructed in the last 10 years of his life, which essentially he wrote himself, which appeared to be by Florence, but actually he wrote it himself. And it does censor and cut out vast amounts of material. So of course, it's just enticed biographer after biographer to investigate his life and in all its detail.
Well, I'm afraid we're probably going to have to start wrapping up now. I'm afraid I think this subject is almost too large to be generalising and summing up and saying that we've got to any particular conclusion. I think what we've really taken away from this is that Hardy's messy relationships are very much seen in Victorian life, even if they weren't that kind of overarching narrative. But it does seem that he's quite unusual in his later works for taking that beyond that step of marriage and actually going and looking at the slightly more messy elements that we see in Jude the Obscure and Tess the d'Urbervilles. But also, I think what we've really enjoyed exploring is the messiness of Hardy's own relationships. And I'm sure these were kind of duplicated all over the place. We see Dickens with his interesting love life, for example, who was even earlier than Hardy. But I think the way that Hardy's biography, we've seen those intertwinings. That's been really, really interesting. And also this kind of overwhelming grief that he has for Emma at the end of it all, and how that comes through in his poetry seems very, very Victorian from what we've been hearing from Holly about this kind of almost kind of cult of grieving and mourning. So I'm afraid I think the end note is that we can't really say that Hardy was particularly unique in this, but there are certainly some things that he really would have given cause to thought for his Victorian readers, things like not wanting to get married if it means that you're going to become the property of a man, and also this sense that marriage does go on and becomes messy, and it isn't just a straightforward timeline like Victoria and Albert had of meeting the person of your dreams as a child and then getting married to them. So thank you, Hardy, for messing up relationships for us and making us realise that if we don't have the fairy tale romance, that is unusual and doesn't mean that we failed at life somehow. So well, thank you so much for joining us on this episode, and it's been really interesting to hear your inputs.
No, thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Interrogating Hardy. Special thanks go out to our sponsors, Batten Solicitors, as well as our funders, Arts Council for England and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Make sure to subscribe here if you want to catch future episodes.